Fuck! The beeping sound of some cars resonated throughout. It was almost like a festival out there. Why were they so violent? Why were they honking so much? Hammering away at his skull, the headache that came from out of nowhere kept on with its relentless punishment. The male, clad in an old Metallica t-shirt and a pair of blue jeans, entered the door with his eyes shut. After various fruitless efforts to recoup from such a blatant and arduous headache, he finally settled down on a seat right inside the waiting room. "Oh good, Trevor, you made it," the youthful receptionist expressed while hidden in obscurity at the rear of the plexiglass. For the life of Trevor, he couldn't and wouldn't dare try to discover where this substantial headache came from. It left him seeing flashes of bloody crimson alongside a brilliant chalky white. Instead, the dazed Trevor found himself comfortable. On his seat, he merely acknowledged the waiting room in its pure splendor. Yeah, I made it," he chirped back. Once again, he retained his hand over his blonde head, grazing ever so delicately. Trevor felt the compulsion to question the young temptress that was perched inside her receptionist's office, all snuggled in her nurse's garb and in the faultless gloom. He could not arbitrate whether she was merely masking her face or if he was too dazed to even acknowledge her very peculiarity. So, what was so stunning about her? It had to be the very intonation of her provocative voice, the type so velvety he had to blush or hit on her. But on his ass, he remained with that headache buffeting harder than a jackhammer against concrete. While he rested his hand on his head, he found himself eyeing the same face of a teenage girl unknown to him. This teen girl had a set of alluring, lush, jade eyes so spectacular it set fireworks to shame in hue and explosion. This teen girl with a complexion unbellished by time or even age put the femme fatale to shame. This teen he knew absolutely nothing about cradled his mind. The image of this girl kept on swirling through every crevice of his mind, slithering around the bombs that were causing him to see crimson and blinding white. It was time for Trevor to either remain in utter agony or purge the pounding headache. With courage and perseverance, he fought through the grandiose headache walking over to the receptionist, who, for some odd reason, knew he had a headache. With her hand extended, the nurse revealed something to him. She extended her hand, granting Trevor a pair of pills. This was odd, but not enough to warrant worry or confusion. "Here you go, Trevor. I hope you feel better," she sensually wished. Grasping the pills, he hoped to identify her face, perhaps now that he was closer. With wide eyes, Trevor set his hazel set over the receptionist. Still, he could not make out her face. It was as though she had no apparent facial expression or even clarity, to be exact. It was all but a blur to him. Trevor knew he wasn't going nuts, considering he could tell she had eyes, lips, ears, and even eyebrows. But in the end, all he could see was a blurred bombshell of a woman. After an abnormal encounter with the receptionist whose name escaped him, he nestled the pills close to his chest after clenching his hand. Then, in a startled, nimble shift of his body, he turned to a waiting room that included two twin girls sitting to the right, a father and his young baby in his arm, and a patient who had recently just entered through the door beside the receptionist area. The outside was brilliant. Trevor could not make out a single thing outside other than a young girl reaching outward. Not a car, not a tree, not even other people. He only saw that beautiful girl. That was rather strange," he whispered to himself. Trevor clenched the pills in his hand, walking over to the electric cooler close to the door that a sickly, ebony-haired girl entered through. Who was she with? Was she with a doctor? Trevor couldn't tell who walked her in. Instead, he worried more about the current matter that had him quite tense and enthralled. The breath of some unknown being had him quite unsettled. It hit him in the earlobe, sending chills down his spine. Shifting swiftly, Trevor surveyed the area once more, just to make sure he didn't miss any of the other patients to find out who breathed on him in such an eerie manner. He couldn't put his finger on who could have done it. Trevor unlatched a plastic cup from the electric cooler, pouring himself water. With his eyes ogled around the individuals while his unimpeded finger forced downward on the button, he didn't pay much attention to what poured into his cup. It was too late to notice. Once the container was beginning to fill, he felt the repercussions of the torrid water beginning bubbling within the plastic cup. The sizzling whispers and sweltering heat wafting from it were enough to retrieve Trevor's attention within mere seconds. With ample haste, he discarded the cup into the trash can, retracting his hand. His fingers slowly stopped pushing the button while he glared at the cold button revealed under his thumb. Turning to the receptionist, he observed her, or tried to, and spoke. "Hey, your machine is broken. Shit's spitting out hot water when I punch the cold button." The receptionist stood up from her seat, vanishing without a word. He gawked through the plexiglass, examining the situation, unable to figure out what was going on. Instead, Trevor shook his head, walking back to his seat. Still, the man and his baby made no sudden movements. The twins, well, they continued playing with each of the dolls they carried with them. Pissed that the water cooler was nothing but cool, he swallowed the pills without water. He leaned back against his chair, hoping to relax. The receptionist was nowhere to be found. With her vacancy, how would anyone know of their appointment? Who would answer the calls that did not resound ever since he made his way into the infrastructure? Not just that, but what if one of the patients went into something serious? After evaluating her performance, he shook his head, declining the thought of asking the irresponsible receptionist out for some dinner. His eyes relocated from the ceiling to the television hung at the corner of the waiting room. His whole attention was on the news that once announced the name he heard when thinking of the receptionist. That name haunted him. It was almost as if he heard it before. But where? His gaze met the illustration on the television. Fuck, what was that all about? Trevor inquired, yet he remained watching the news. In other news, we have Nonoko Watanabe here to share her experience in those dungeons. He heard the anchorman begin. The channel mysteriously changed. Right when Trevor was about to unhinge his eyes from the television he usually didn't care to watch, he witnessed the most unusual, grody, yet unsettling images any human could observe on national television. Trevor's jaw dropped upon sight. His eyes reverted down to the ground. Besides a chaotic car wreck on a familiar street, a portrait of mass murders was demonstrated throughout the television broadcast. A man entirely overtaken by flies was chuckling over a body of a little girl who squirmed on the dirt. She was near a road that subsequently led to a hospital. That hospital looked so familiar. She was tied by the hands. Her feet were set free. Her very expression was that of someone who could not scream for help due to the bruises coating her very neck. Marks of strangling and lashes were quite visible. With the infested man poised over the poor blonde girl, he greedily gripped her grimy hair after crouching. With his free hand, he brought down a machete that cleaved at her neck, untimely severing her head from her shoulders. Blood fluxed in hopes of formulating a pool of crimson around the man. Flies dipped into the pool. The images burned into Trevor's cerebellum. He no longer examined the devastation and tragedy that he was subject to watch. What the fuck is wrong with that receptionist? We shouldn't be watching this shit, Trevor yelped. He erupted, unplugging the television after attempting to change the channels. They were all showcasing the horrific nature of man and violence. The strange thing was it revealed the same man coated by flies. Trevor held a hand to his stomach, not feeling entirely well. After moving to his seat, he eyed someone he didn't acknowledge before. Was he always sitting there? He thought to himself. No one even entered the room, nor left the doctor's room. So where did the older man come from? Trevor heard it all too well, though. A strong ticking like the pounding he once understood when he had a headache. His attention straying from the older man to this abnormal ticking. Tick, tock, tick, tock, tick, tock. The malignant ticking lessened after the sixth talk. Tick, tock, tick. Something was dreadfully wrong. His eyes shifted from the older man fastened in regular street clothes to the clock that was incredibly boisterous in distributing sound. Immediately, Trevor looked to the twins, then to the older man that wasn't there before, then to the unmoving father and his infant, hoping that perhaps they too noted the clock that hung over the receptionist area. Trevor's eyes, again, gawked preposterously long at the clock, hoping to find some explanation, but he drew blanks. He drew blanks on the older man and where he came from. He even drew blanks on the whereabouts of the receptionist. Nothing was making sense at this point, but he could not just give up, right? Trevor gulped slightly, only to get up to reach for a magazine stationed under the television on a small table. While he attempted to read the magazine to get his mind off things, he could still hear the clamorous clock that hung upside down the receptionist area. Trevor shook his head, but upon shaking it, he had awakened yet another sound that echoed throughout the room. The pumping of blood and pounding of a heart resonated far and near. Quickly, he delved into the magazine in front of him, hoping that the hallucinations would end. What do we have here? Trevor whispered to himself. He was reading over the magazine's name, his brow raised. Turning the pages, he began feeling even his heart sink with the pounding of the very beat that once invaded his mind. Everything inside the magazine had him embarrassed beyond belief. Plopping the mag down beside him, Trevor ran his hands over his short blonde hair, taking a deep breath, trying his very best to relax. He took one glance over at the magazine and read, "Welcome to Nightmare Land," written in script on the cover. The images arrayed consisted of gore porn which could rob one's sanity. Trevor only shook his head. His hand was already trembling from the uncommon magazine. He couldn't wait for the receptionist to come back. Trevor had an enormous list of things to complain about, but sadly enough, she was nowhere to be found. He soon acknowledged that the very existence of the older man that once occupied a seat in the waiting room was no longer there. Crazily looking about from left to right, to even getting up hoping to spy inside the doctor's area, he could not unearth the raggedy older man. Instead, he was left here in the waiting room with the twins that conclusively fell asleep and the father and his infant. Hoping to attain some answers, he walked over to the father, settling beside him. "Hey, I'm Trevor. Nice to meet you. Could you tell me where the old man went?" he asked. The father remained unmoving. Trevor sighed, unable to receive an answer from the man. Rather than wasting time, he moved from the seat near the father back over to where he once sat, averting the clock. He tried not to awaken the twins, avoiding the magazine that lay beside him. He heard the marvelous receptionist's voice echo throughout the waiting room. Like a fish to bait, he turned his attention to her. "Sophia Livette, you are next. Sophia Livette, you are next." Trevor glanced about within the waiting room, wondering who Sophia Livette could be. He wondered if it was one of the twins, or maybe the infant. Just when he was about to dismiss the thought, the twins awakened almost as though in a hex. In impeccable sync, they sat up. Unitly, they got up. Collectively, they walked up. Holding each other's hand, they walked into the doctor's area, into the gloom. Were they both Sophia Livette? There was no way. The name itself was oh so familiar. The receptionist's magnificent, shapely body kept the door wide open for them. Trevor could tell it was her. This was his chance to give her a mouthful, and just as he stood up, he felt that same bombardment of flashing lights of crimson terror and white madness wreak havoc within him. Holding his head, the sporadic images of the young girl he once saw held him stationed right where he stood. Beads of sweat ran down his forehead and cheeks as the heat had him struggle to even cope with just standing, let alone what he desired to do. "Who are you?" Trevor whispered, struggling to keep himself up at this point. "Who the hell are you? Why do I know your name? Who are you?" His words heightened in volume. "Why do I keep thinking of you? Where did I meet you? Why am I thinking of you? Why?" The more he grunted the same question, the less unbalanced he got. The screeching from the doctor's room brought him back to his sensibilities. Trevor immediately glared over at the father, then again at the door which the twins entered through. He rushed to the door, opening it, but found the door completely shut and locked. "Don't you hear that? The girls are screaming for help! What the fuck is this damn doctor doing? We have to help them!" Trevor shouted in madness. He pounded on the door with all his valor. The assault did diddly to the door. Moving to the plexiglass that severed the receptionist and the patients, he gripped the air once more, knocking hard against it, pleading for his needs to be met. After several shrieks of anguish, the girls were liberated from the room. The receptionist swiftly shut the door behind the girls. Before Trevor knew it, he found himself in front of the twins. He looked down at the twins, noticing nothing happened to them. They were superbly excellent, unscathed by what terror he thought overcame them. No, something had happened to them. He could feel it. He saw it in their eyes, acknowledging complete emptiness as opposed to before they entered. A vacuum that was much vaster than the galaxy we humans lived in could be determined within their eyes. Softly, he crouched to whisper, "Hey, you two all right? I guess your parents are a bunch of lowlifes to watch over you two. Hey, what happened in there? If you don't mind me asking. I heard you screaming. I promise I won't hurt you. If anything, I'm here to help you." The girls remained reserved up until they faced each other. As if they'd seen a ghost, they each cried profanities mirrored by what appeared to be a grave, stern man's voice over their own. Awestruck, Trevor stood back up, watching their next performance of shock value. They each grabbed each other's eyeballs, and without any wasted motion, they ripped each other's eyes right out from their sockets. Mangling the eyeball, each giggled, still mirrored by supernatural laughter. Blood poured down their porcelain cheeks while giggling until turning to face Trevor. "What the fuck?" Trevor groaned loudly. "We do not need help. We do not need guidance. We are already home. We're already at home." The two girls sang, bewildering Trevor even further. His heart pounded in his chest after witnessing such atrocity as he moved back away from the girls. The twins began to walk closer to him ever so slowly, which caused Trevor to move away. Shaking his head with no words spoken, Trevor turned around, hoping to dash out of the waiting room. Gazing down at the unmoving father and the baby that he held in his arm, Trevor knew not what to do at this point. "Hey! Are you asleep or what? We gotta get these girls to a real hospital. This place is like some sort of death camp." A bewildered Trevor lamented. Gripping the man's shoulder, he shook him a bit, trying to get his attention, but even then, he could make the man blink not once. Trevor realized that the man that sat there since the beginning did not even budge, not to tread to the bathroom, for a drink, or even for his turn with the doctor. He knew now what was up. This man was already deceased, a hallowed shell of what he once was. Trevor's face shifted from one of shock to one of utter antipathy. The stench that never did meet his nostrils before now wafted throughout, wringing his neck with all its repugnance. The lifeless eyes of a defunct man gazed right through Trevor. All he could do was hold his hand up against his mouth, with tears rolling down his cheeks. "No. What the fuck is this? What is going on? Where am I?" Trevor announced intensely, hoping to achieve an answer. Filled with many questions, yet surrounded by what he thought was utterly unnatural, he swiftly grasped the bonnet from the infant, then scanned down upon the baby, fully anticipating the baby to be just as deceased as its father. To his surprise, the baby was unscathed and sound. What perplexed him entirely was the very actuality that the baby was indeed terrorized and in hysteria. Tears swept down its rotund cheeks. Its mouth made for what seemed to bellow, yet nothing escaped its mouth in terms of sound. Gulping, unsure what to do, Trevor reached the baby's cheek, gently tracing it. The single dab caused an uproar to burst from the baby itself, almost as if he turned the volume up with just his touch. The pain was evident. Bruises on the cheek that Trevor touched were apparent as well. Stepping back, away from the infant, Trevor held his hands up against his ear. To his disdain, blood dripped down his sides. He moved back only to bump into the twins behind him. Trevor couldn't help but look up at the waiting room, examining its entirety. Blood blanketed the windows and walls. The sprinklers up above were turned on, allowing blood to cascade throughout. Gazing at the door he entered through, Trevor could discern a youthful teen positioned on the other side. The door was untouched by blood, which rained down over the deceased here in the waiting room. He saw her very clearly. She smiled. The teen was so astoundingly beautiful. He could see her lips. He could read them too. He soon recognized who she was and what she represented. But what did she say? He read her lips, further repeating to himself what was spoken. "Thank you?" Trevor breathed. "Thank you for what? Thank you? What does that mean?" The twins both bound his wrists. As he abruptly turned, the eyeless twins extended their free hand to open the door to the doctor's dominion. Trevor shook turbulently, glaring at the senior man from before standing with a deep gaze over him. A lofty smile etched over bloody lips, horns protruding from his skull, alongside a spade-tipped tail swaying with an uncontrollable lust for more violence as it lashed against freshly split flesh adorned by a nurse's outfit. Trevor took one last glance back at the door untouched by death and uttered the girl's name with a complete understanding of what's going on. "Sophia Levette." Sophia was no longer standing there. He knew very well now the girl's name. How could he forget? After that car crash, the massive headache, the bellows and tears that came after meeting her, how could he forget? Trevor no longer resisted. He finally came to terms with her thank you and his decision. Trevor no longer fought back against those that tugged him deeper. The entities pulled him deeper into the waiting room.